I'm Charlie Kyle, the principal of Innis College, and welcome to another Innis College virtual event. I will begin by reading the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So I'm happy to welcome back to the college one of our favorite alumni, Jeff Rubin, a man of incomparable scope of thought and irrepressible energy. And I've had some discussions with Jeff about the topic of tonight's talk, which is the core of his new book, The Expendables. And I can guarantee you, you're in for a very thought-provoking evening. I am not here to introduce Jeff, but rather to introduce the person who will introduce him and who will moderate, Jonathan Kay. And so let me just tell you a bit about Jonathan. Jonathan is a Toronto-based author and journalist. He is a recipient of 2 national newspaper awards, former editor of The Walrus, and contributor to the National Post. Currently, Jonathan is the editor of Colette and host of the Colette podcast. His forthcoming books include Panics and Persecutions, 20 Tales of Cancel Culture Heretics. That obviously tested me beyond my capacity. And also A More Beautiful and Sumptuous Edifice, Tracing the History of Film Exhibition Through 3 Generations. I have to have Jonathan back to talk about that. One thing I will say before we begin, because Jonathan will be taking it over from here, is that we will be raffling 2 copies of Jeff's book to 2 lucky attendees. So please stay for the entirety of the event because that will happen at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Jonathan.
Thanks very much. And it's my pleasure to participate in this. Jeff Rubin, very interesting guy because he was the prototypical Bay Street person that I have in my imagination, the stereotype anyway. He was an economist at CIBC Wood Gundy and CIBC World Markets. And then he left all that and he became a book author, and he's worked at think tanks, and he writes for the Globe and Mail. He's written several books, including one about oil called Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller, which is how I first heard of him. And now this book, which I enjoyed reading, it's The Expendables. I've interviewed him, subtitle I'll read to you, How the Middle Class Got Screwed by Globalization. And a fascinating guy. I recently talked to him on the podcast. And the book comes out at a really interesting time. Jeff, you can hear me?
Yep. So,
I mean, I can tell reading the first part of your book that the coronavirus pandemic occurred obviously just as, I'm guessing, as you're wrapping up some of the last chapters. You incorporate the pandemic into your book, the thesis of which, I think the subtitle says it all, how the middle class is getting hurt by globalization and has been getting hurt for the last couple of decades. And you describe at the beginning of your book how coronavirus shows the limits of the benefits of globalization. Can you expand a little bit on that? Because the fact that we're having this event in this format is itself a product, obviously, of the pandemic.
Right. You know, at first I thought that my book would be a victim of the pandemic because it was supposed to be released at the end of April. All the bookstores were closed. My Cross Canada book tour was obviously canceled because of social distancing requirements. But then it dawned on me that the pandemic brought into focus really everything that I was saying about the pitfalls of globalization and demonstrated it in a way to people that couldn't have been more poignant in terms of their own lives. Because up until that point, I think it was fair to say that with the exception of the populist movement on both left and right, the majority of people in the mainstream thought that not only was globalization beneficial, but maybe more importantly, inevitable. And all of a sudden, it didn't look so inevitable.
And you're more specific also. You have the example of things like not just borders being closed, but basic protective equipment. When there was a shortage, suddenly borders mattered.
Yeah. And instead of tariffs stopping trade, there were export bans to stop trade. So when you desperately needed global supply chains to work, not only for your economy's health, but for your health, when it came to getting N95 respirator masks or ventilators, the global supply chains let you down. I don't think people are going to forget that for a long time.
So this is a very political moment we're having this discussion. Obviously, there was a vice presidential debate in the United States, which maybe a lot of people tuned into this week. But one interesting thing about your book is there were a lot of themes in it that, and I think you recognize this, when you attack globalization these days, it's not clear whether you're doing it from the right or the left. And I was in New Hampshire covering the Republican primaries, the Democratic primaries, and I saw Bernie Sanders speak. And a lot of what you say in the book, I think, would resonate with Bernie Sanders fans. On the other hand, I mean, you don't speak in the style of Trump, obviously, but some of the complaints about globalization, I think, that you have in the book would resonate with Trump supporters. Is that something you thought of? Maybe is that a conversation you had with your publisher? Like, is people...
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if I had a conversation with my publisher, but one thing was clear if you listen to what either person was saying, not only today, but back in 2016, they were basically talking from the same page when it came to trade. And had the elite of the Democratic Party not conspired to undermine Sanders, and had Sanders won the nomination and went on to defeat Trump, the US and China would be having the exact same trade war that they're having right now. And NAFTA would have been torn up because Sanders, like Trump, thought that NAFTA was a terrible deal, injurious to American workers and particularly auto workers. And Sanders, like Trump, thought that the WTO was basically a rigged game designed at the expense of American workers. Now, when I say American workers, that could just as equally be applied to Canadian workers, British workers, German workers, because the phenomena is across the OECD. But that often gets lost in the sort of media coverage that we're immersed in, that basically Sanders and Trump were saying the same thing. Now, you know, I don't think that either supporters of Trump or Sanders would want to recognize that in terms of the other, but the fact is that if you listen to what they said on trade in 2016, and if you listen to what they said on trade in 2020, they were saying basically the same thing, which just goes to show you, Jonathan, and this was true 100 years ago during the first rise of populism, populism can bat from both sides of the plate.
And what's interesting is when people talk about opposition to immigration, often they're using it to describe conservatives, but as you describe, conservatives themselves, at least in the United States, are split on the immigration issue because there are plenty of corporate conservatives who are just fine with lots of immigrants. Maybe in certain industries, it depresses the price of labor. A lot of these issues, as you said, cross lines. In terms of open borders and not just trade flows, but immigration flows, is part of the challenge faced by the middle class, does that have to do with immigration pressures?
It's certainly a factor. I wouldn't say as great a factor as trade, but let's get back to your original point. Who's been the big supporter of immigration? And I just don't mean today, go back 100 years ago when we had the biggest migration, like something like 30 million Europeans migrated to the United States between 1850 and 1914. It was the plutocrats. It was Andrew Carnegie who called them a stream of gold. And who fought immigration? It was American labor. And that's not a uniquely American story. The Australian story is exactly the same. And why did they fight? Well, because immigrants weren't just a source of cheap labor. they had a depressing impact on the wages of native labor. Not everybody, not skilled trades, not doctors, not lawyers, but unskilled labor. There's no question that they depressed their wages. And that's why there was a lot of pushback. So I guess the question is, what really divides us? Is it really race or is it class? I mean, you know, the popular narrative is that immigrants are allies of victims of racism, like Black people, for example. But historically, it's really been the unskilled Black laborer who has borne the brunt of the impact of unskilled migrants, because they're the last person hired, and their wage, not the wages of doctors and lawyers, have been affected. So if you look back at US policy, after World War I, there were the two Immigration Acts of 1921 and 24 that cut immigration from around 1 million to 150,000. It was American labor that basically agitated for those changes. And it really wasn't until migration was cut off that you saw the huge movement of so-called emancipated Blacks from the South move north to occupy the industrial jobs. Because up until then, they would have taken a back seat to migrant laborers, again, the last hired.
So we have a lot of good questions coming up, but I wanted to talk about one of the big themes in the book, which is about one of the forces that are decades ago did protect the middle class, which is labor unions, and why those have fallen away. And I brought a prop with me because today, as I was walking my dog, my neighbor threw something. A lot of people in my neighborhood throw out great stuff. And it's called Pastime Puzzles. It's a puzzle from 1935. It's a woodcut puzzle. It's a child's toy, and I got it because I love puzzles. But I don't know if you can see it. There's this fascinating little note on the inside. And this is an amazing thing. This is a child's puzzle, and there's a note. This is from 1935. It says, this puzzle was sawed by, and it gives a worker number. It was polished by, and it gives another worker number. It was inspected by, and it gives another worker number. On December 10th, 1935, there were at least 70 workers at this puzzle factory. I don't know where that puzzle factory is now. I guarantee it's not in North America. It's probably run by a computer out of some teenage laptop. But all those people probably they were skilled workers, they were craftsmen, they belonged to unions, and they could demand good wages. The equivalent of those people now are balancing jobs with Uber, which doesn't even treat people as workers, it calls them independent contractors. Or they're in the service industry somewhere, or maybe they're running a web business. They're not in unions anymore. When you were writing this book, didn't you despair that the heavy lifting to generate the rights and the equity you're talking about here, usually that's been done by unions, but is there any hope for a resurgent union movement that would help you implement some of the ideas in this book?
Well, first, I think we got to ask ourselves, why did unions disappear? Like in the heyday of the middle class, which at least in North America would have been the 1950s, the 1960s, 1 in every 3 private sector workers in the United States was unionized. Today, it's 1 out of 20. And that's more or less been the pattern across the OECD. Unions used to be a virtue for workers because they got workers better benefits and wages. But what was a virtue in the past has become a vice today. Plant closures of unionized plants are over double that of non-unionized plants. So what caused unions to go away? Well, just consider the few remaining unions that exist today. I mean, going on strike is pretty suicidal, because if you go on strike, what's likely to happen in the middle of the night, a fleet of trucks come on a giant repo operation, haul all the machinery they can take out of the plant and haul it to a new plant being opened in Mexico, where workers get 1/10 of your wage. And the plant that you used to work for 20 to 30 years has just been sold to become a high-rise condo development. What's the difference between the 1950s and today? one huge difference. In the 1950s, if you hauled your plant to Mexico, and there were even bigger wage incentives to do that back then than there are today, if you went to Mexico or you went to China, you wouldn't have a hope in hell of ever being able to ship anything made in those plants back to the countries where those jobs were coming from, Canada, the US, because they were protected by high tariff walls. So after you paid the tariff, there was no incentive to move your plant to the low wage domain. However, after decades and decades of GATT and later WTO trade liberalization and trilateral free trade deals like NAFTA, those tariff walls were disassembled brick by brick, and now you could move that factory with absolute impunity. So the decline of unions is intrinsically related to the changes in trade policy. And if unions are going to make a recovery, it will once again be trade policy that will determine that.
Well, I think you're a brave man for putting trade policy to a certain extent at the front and center of this book, because the modern trend is to offer other kind of silver bullets, including some kind of guaranteed income. It goes by many names, UBI, but it basically comes down to giving people money, trying to address inequities in society and trying to bring back a resurgent middle class. And you talk about that in the book. It's actually something conservatives talk about too, because it cuts through some of the red tape by having a universal program instead of a lot of means testing. Could you tell me the problem with universal income as a panacea to some of the problems you're talking about here?
It's a great idea if money is free. If the government can just print checks and give it to everybody, no problem. But money's not free. And there are limits to what governments can provide. And in fact, if you look at the Social Security system, ever since Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, it's gone the other way. In fact, the irony is that as free trade has exposed more and more workers to the social safety net, the social safety net itself has shrunk. And that has to do with the mobility of capital and free trade. So, the idea of a guaranteed income flies in the face of what's actually been happening. I mean, I know the COVID-19, there has been exceptional circumstances of income support, but up until then, the trend for the last 20 years has been a reduction in the social security net. And the reason for that is that if governments wanted to redress any of the issues that I've raised in this book, like income distribution, and they wanted to redress it by raising taxes on capital gains or dividends, or imposing an inheritance tax, or raising the minimum wage, the immediate response from business will be, if you do that, there'll even be a greater exodus of jobs and investment that's already occurring, and you will hurt the very people you're trying to help. But that's only because today, when capital doesn't like what it sees, it's free to move. It's the mobility of capital. That's what free really means in free trade. And that results in a system where it's a race to the bottom. Like, sure, if you're a shareholder, you're saying we're only optimizing profits and taking advantage of the trading environment as it exists. And that's a perfectly legitimate way for shareholders to look at it. But if you're a worker, it's a race to the bottom, and it's getting pretty crowded down there.
As your book proceeds, you kind of eliminate any other solution except for something that at least struck me as protectionist. But I guess protectionist has sort of become a four-letter word in policy circles. How do you deal with that fact that, especially in Canada, where we spent years fretting over Trump's protectionism, we've seen that as sort of a, something to be feared as opposed to something to advocate? Is it uniquely difficult to make these arguments from Canada, where we're terrified of free trade being cut off?
Yeah, well, it's a four-letter word to maybe Magna shareholders or Ford shareholders or GM shareholders, but it sure ain't a four-letter word to the few remaining Magna employees in Canada, the United States, or the Ford's GM employees, because in fact, what they've done is they've benefited. For the first time in 17, 18 years, manufacturing employment is growing in the United States. And that's not an accident. That has everything to do with trade policy or the explicit threat that if you don't invest in capacity and jobs, I'm going to tariff you.
But I'm also talking about our politicians. Doug Ford is a conservative, Justin Trudeau's a liberal, and yet they both kind of sing from the same songbook when it comes to.
They all sing from the same songbook, including the NDP. And that's what's really lacking here. And it's a puzzle. And I'll tell you why. Because the conditions that have led to populism, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, what's the movements in Europe, those conditions exist just as much in Canada. Yet there's been no political expression for the expendables, for the people left behind. That the conservatives and the NDP and the liberals all are globalists. They might have their own partisan guises, but what we need in Canada is some real choices. I'd like to see a Bernie Sanders dude run the NDP. And I'd like to see a Donald Trump dude be head of the Conservatives. And then I think there would be some real choices, because this government in Ottawa, this Trudeau-Freeland government, is probably one of the most globalist governments left in the G7.
All right, well, strong words. I want to bring it local because we had some good questions that were submitted beforehand. Mark asked a question, which it's probably something maybe many people listening to this think about every day. What are the implications of what you're describing for a city like Toronto? When I moved to Toronto, you could buy, this is only less than 20 years ago, you could buy a house for $200,000-$300,000. Now I think an average house is something like 1.5 million. Is what is happening in Toronto, where college graduates, like they have no hope of buying a house, how is that connected to the trade policy issues that you describe in the book?
Okay, well, let's take the millennials, whether they live in Toronto or they live in Omaha, they're basically facing the same boat. This is the most educated cohort in the post-war period, because their parents thought that education was a gateway to higher paying jobs. In fact, they make less than their parents. They're the first cohort to do so. Whereas 70% of baby boomers like myself were middle class, it's only 60% of millennials, 50% of Generation X and Z. Why is that happening? It gets back to what kind of jobs are being created. Is it Uber and Lyft, or you're working on some website type job? Or is it working like at the Oshawa GM plant? Okay, the Oshawa GM plant isn't there because GM can move its production to Mexico and then ship everything from that plant back to Canada without paying a tariff. So the kind of jobs that are being created are in the lower paying service sector, and more recently in the so-called gig economy, whereas you mentioned in your earlier remarks, you're not even considered a worker, you're considered an independent contractor, and hence can be paid below the minimum wage. StatsCan estimates already over 10% of the labor force is in the gig economy. And with the pervasive digitization of the economy, that percentage is going to grow stronger every year. Back in the 60s and 50s, having a middle class, having a job was a gateway out of poverty. Today, in the gig economy, it's a gateway into poverty.
So Rose Dyson, who's watching, question is, how do the challenges of the climate crisis factor into your thinking? And the subtext here is that the Copenhagen and Paris Accords, this is all about cooperating between nations, and to a certain extent, thinking of the planet as one unit. Does the sort of agenda you're setting out cut against the grain of the kind of collaboration, including economic collaboration, that would be necessary to fight climate change?
It does, but let me point out that the country that has reduced its emissions the most is a country led by someone who doesn't even believe in climate change. And I refer, of course, to the United States. And the reason that the United States has cut their emissions so dramatically is basically the substitution of nat gas and renewables for coal. So I'm not sure international coordination is as important as we say. I mean, it's very important for governments like Justin Trudeau's government to make 20-year pledges of how we're going to reduce our emissions in the future, knowing full well that we don't have a hope in hell of meeting them. We've never met our emission reduction targets, and that goes back to the first ones promised in Kyoto. But I think you'll find that, if individual countries are incented to reduce their emissions, they'll reduce their emissions. And, that will basically occur on a national level. And you don't necessarily have to have enlightened leaders to do that. Because as I say, the United States is reducing their emissions and their president doesn't even acknowledge climate change.
So Olga asks, a good question, how much can we solve through more efficient taxation and income redistribution? And I realized I already asked you about guaranteed income, but you keep talking about
that. There's taxation.
Well, you talk about the difference between shareholders and workers.
Right.
I mean, like, especially in the United States, there's this really low tax rate on capital gains and asset appreciation. Could we solve this by
let's not point the finger at the United States. I'd have a lot to say about Canada's so-called progressive tax system, because I think that's a joke. Okay. Rich people don't pay taxes in this country. Workers pay taxes in this country. Now, some viewers might go, Jeff, how can you say that? Top federal, provincial, marginal tax rates are above 50% for high income earners. And they're right. But guess what? Really rich people, they don't make their money through wage income. They make their money through capital gains or inheriting dynastic wealth. Capital gains is only 50% is taxable. So if you make like $20 million in capital gains, 10 million goes untaxed. If you make a minimum wage and are struggling to pay the rent, every single dollar of it is taxed. And then, of course, there's the question of inheritance taxes. In progressive Canada, it is the only G7 country not to have an inheritance tax. Even in billionaire-friendly United States, there's a 40% inheritance.
Yeah, but it only kicks in at something like 2 million. I mean, it
only kicks in at 2 million. But let me give you an example. Like Thomas Lutke, he's the principal shareholder of Shopify. Forbes estimates his estate is worth $8 billion. Maybe the dude's going to give it away to charity for all I know, but let's just say that he were to die and his kids inherit $8 billion tax-free. Well, if they were in the United States, they would pay the equivalent in taxes of what 125,000 households in Canada pay every year. So, sure, our system's progressive if you're a wage earner, but if you're a plutocrat, you walk away scot-free. Let's see how Chrystia Freeland, a finance minister who once wrote a book about plutocrats, treats them in her first budget. Maybe it's time we had an inheritance tax in Canada. Maybe capital gains should be taxed the same way as people making a minimum wage are taxed. Just a couple of recommendations to throw out there.
Matthew Rika asks, what is your overall position on the World Trade Organization, or WTO? Does it have a place in regulating the global trade, or do you just think it should have less stature in terms of deciding what kind of tariffs and other barriers countries can place on trade?
Well, quite apart from what I think, what is the status of the WTO? It's on a ventilator. It's on life support, because the fact is that the Trump administration has blocked the appointment of any appellate judges, and it's non-functioning. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? Well, if you're a shareholder, probably a bad thing. If you're an expendable, probably a good thing. The WTO will say that we want the world to be governed by a rules-based trading system. And who's going to disagree with that? Seems fair. But what folk don't realize is there's different rules for different countries. If you want to export a vehicle into the United States, you would pay a 2.5% most favored nation under WTO rules. But if you wanted to export the same vehicle to China, you would have to pay a 25% tariff under WTO rules, because China, even though it's forecast to have a bigger GDP than the US in the next 10 years, is deemed a developing country. So I think that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are 100% right when they say the WTO rules are rules designed to screw the American worker. And what Trump has argued for is FART, fair and reciprocal trade agreement, which means if China's going to put a 25% tariff on a car being exported from the United States to China, the US is going to put a 25% tariff on goods from China being exported to the US. That makes a lot of sense to me.
In a perfect political world, I suppose substantive issues like this would actually get discussed during political debates. Unfortunately, we didn't hear much about trade policy during the current round of debates. But Toby Conliffe asked an interesting question. When you wrote this book, the Canadian federal deficit was a negligible fraction of the economy. Now it looks like we're headed to the kind of deficit that maybe we haven't seen since World War II. Who's going to bear the brunt of that?
Very good question. As a percentage of GDP, these are going to be World War II deficits, okay? Anytime we've had this before, and even deficits not even of this size, but I'm thinking of the Jean Chrétien deficits in the middle 90s, were followed by a period of severe fiscal restraint, spending cutbacks and big tax hikes. When it comes to trade policy, the middle class is viewed as expendables. But when it comes to paying down deficits, the middle class is uppermost in the government's mind. Who's going to pay down this right now, 350, it'll probably be 500 when all is said and done? It's going to be the expendables. It's not going to be the plutocrats. It's not going to be people who derive their incomes from capital gains and dividends. It's going to be people who rely on wages, and they're going to be taxed, and they're going to be taxed punitively.
So how much of the squeezing of the middle class that we're seeing has nothing to do with trade policy? It's just a function of technology. And I'm asking because I've done some reporting on Silicon Valley, and I've gone to Mountain View. I've interviewed people at Google, Facebook, all of these companies. And what's striking is just how few employees they actually employ. Like WordPress, everyone uses WordPress. WordPress has like 100 employees or a couple hundred employees. Putting aside trade policy, you have these world-leading brands that actually employ a fairly small number of people. Even Google, compared to the number of people who use Google or Apple products, they don't employ that many people. No matter what trade policy is, doesn't technology inherently have a middle class squeezing aspect to it, in that there's a few people designing these software products and everybody else is using them?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because it's true that the tech sector doesn't employ that many people itself. But what it employs is a huge service sector to support it. And talk about Silicon Valley. There's, 30 to 40,000 people in Silicon Valley who sleep in their cars and RVs because they work in the service sector and they haven't seen a real wage increase in 20, 30 years. In the old days, the janitor at IBM would retire a millionaire because everybody in IBM would get shares. And if you stuck around long enough for 30, 40 years, you'd be a millionaire. Today, there are no janitors at Facebook. Facebook cafeteria, they had to go on strike because they weren't getting even minimum wage. So, yes, there's that issue. There's the other aspect, like if you were to ask Ford or Magna why they don't have any employees, and they'd go, blame it on the machines. And while there's no doubt that an assembly plant today doesn't have the same employment footprint as it would have had 20 years ago. The key reason why employment has shrunk in Canada and US auto industry isn't the mechanization of plants, but rather where the plants are located. Because that plant in Mexico is just as mechanized, just as automated as that plant in Detroit or Oshawa would have been. The only difference is the people running those machines are getting paid $2.50 an hour instead of $25 an hour.
So to work at an auto plant, you actually have to be on site at the plant. Geography matters. Keon asks an interesting question about people who are web developers or digital marketers. You know, if I need a program written, I can go on the web right now and I can get someone in India or South America or Africa to write it for me for pennies on the dollar compared to what the guy down the street would charge. No trade agreement in the world is going to be able to prevent me from going on email and doing that.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. He's absolutely right. But business services is what you're talking about. And there are like, I come from the financial industry. Many financial institutions have their portfolio marked to market overnight by programmers in India as opposed to people on Wall Street or Bay Street doing it. And that's going to continue. But relative to the goods sector, that is a very small factor in the immiserization of the middle class. The mass majority of the service sector, you can't arbitrage. Like, people aren't going to have a root canal in Hong Kong. People aren't going to go for a haircut in Vietnam. So the service sector has been more or less insulated from trade, with the exception that you pointed out of the business services. But where we've really seen the hollowing out of middle class jobs hasn't been on the service sector, it's been on the goods sector. Because up until Donald Trump, goods employment had dropped by about 5 million from around 2000 to 2016. And in Canada, we haven't produced a net job in the goods sector in 18 years.
How much of this is on the demand side in terms of when I meet young people, and you know, I'm in my 50s now, so young could mean people even who are in their 30s, they don't value goods as much as other generations do. Cars for one thing. My eldest daughter turned 16, and having a car is the furthest thing on her mind. At my high school, everyone wanted to get a car. They basically want phones, they want apps, they want to have wonderful experiences, they want to see their friends. To a certain extent, is this a demand side phenomenon?
Well, there's another aspect to it. I mean, here's what globalization has brought. It's brought cheaper prices. And anything that we repatriate from Mexico or China, whether it's a cell phone or a car, is going to cost more money if we make it here. You know, the irony is that Walmart parking lots are filled with workers who are shopping themselves out of their very jobs. Okay. Getting to the point that you raised, well, my kids don't want goods. My kids want apps. Well, what do they get the apps over? They get it over a cell phone. Where does that cell phone made? Apple doesn't make any cell phones in North America. Apple doesn't make any computers in North America. Cell phones are cheap because they're made in sweatshops where people get $2 an hour. Okay, Apple just sources them from China, and if not China, then Vietnam or India, low wage sources. If all of a sudden those iPhones were made in North America, and a tariff can do that, I just wonder what impact that will have, because all of the dislocation from digitization and using apps, there's a hardware element, and it's the price of the phone. And if the price of the phone is low, then obviously you've got more labor displacing apps. If the price of the phone is high, then the opposite is true. So in other words, people who are getting displaced, taxi drivers by Uber, Lyft people, all of that substitution is really contingent on the price of the hardware. And the price of the hardware is globalized as much, even more than cars and the rest of the goods sector is.
So we just had a throne speech here in Canada a couple weeks ago, which is a good way to see what the publicly expressed priorities of our federal government is. And this brings me to John's question. What can we do to get governments to see long-term versus short-term? Here in Canada, and I don't think the situation is that different, we have a government promising to plant trees. It doesn't plant trees. Justin Trudeau promised a ban on plastic bags, which is nice, but I'm not sure that's the biggest priority of many Canadians. Have you seen a reduction in the event horizon for governments in the time that you've been writing about policy?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I think it's great that we're having a green economy, but, I think it's a little bit more important that middle-class households haven't seen a real increase in 20 years than what we do with plastic bags.
And Trudeau did raise the tax. I mean, to give him his due, he did raise the tax rate for high earners is one of the first things he did. So to a certain extent,
yeah, but that's really rich people, they don't make their money.
Right.
Like the point I'm making is it's not from wages. Let's see like tax capital gains the same way as the tax.
But then if he did that, he'd be attacked, or maybe not attacked, but criticized by some of the same people you used to work with at the big banks.
I don't work there anymore.
You don't work there anymore. Part of your resume, a CIBC, but you know the culture.
Oh, I know the culture real well.
But when we talk about the United States, we talk about how there's all these powerful lobbyists. That word isn't used as much in Canada, but is that a factor here, that you do have the sort of people who are private high wealth clients at banks who are lobbying?
Of course, and the Business Council on National Issues will say exactly what the Koch brothers would say in the United States. I mean, yeah, they've held sway. It's time to reject those folks. It's time to have some real alternatives. And I get back to the point I made, like, so far from what I see, maybe you see it differently, all three major parties in Canada basically read from the same globalist script. They have their own little partisan trappings on that, but there are no real, I don't hear Singh or O'Toole get up and say, you know what, we gotta put some trade barriers in here. We gotta bring the auto pact back. We gotta protect middle-class jobs. I don't hear that. Maybe I will, but right now I don't hear that.
I mean, part of it is that your book, it's based on the traditional idea that class is a big barrier in our society. And from both the right and the left, there's an emphasis on other factors such as race and sex and gender. And to a certain extent, this is a call, your book, I think, is a call to recognize, I think, what Marxists have long recognized. It's one of the things I think Marxists got right. Class really matters.
It definitely does. But if we can pretend that it's not class, it's gender, it's race, then I guess we don't have to bother addressing any of the class issues, like how 1% of the population has 80% of the economy's wealth. We can focus on other things. And for the 1%, that's a good news story.
And by the way,
a great news story for the other 99%, for the 1%, let's not talk about class.
And of course, the focus on other markers of identity comes from both sides of the spectrum. So it's a bipartisan affair. Nick asked about Joe Biden saying during the debate with Trump that he and the Obama administration brought auto manufacturing back to the United States. But
that's laughable. I mean, that's laughable.
Well, you did say that manufacturing is going up in the United States, perhaps at Canada.
Yeah, but not under Joe Biden. In fact, Biden said that manufacturing was falling under Trump, and that's an abject lie. Just look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In fact, one thing that Trump can claim is for the first time since 2000, manufacturing employment was going up, and not just manufacturing employment, but employment in steel, aluminum, and autos. Obama, on the other hand, as late as 2015, said publicly, resigned the fact that, look, trying to protect manufacturing jobs is a lost cause in today's world trading system. Well, he's right. It was a lost cause if you're going to adhere to WTO rules. But you know what? If you throw WTO rules out the window, like Donald Trump did, then all of a sudden it isn't a lost cause.
So Elizabeth asks, and this is a question I asked you during our podcast, about your book, Why Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller. And of course, just to reiterate, to vastly simplify your thesis, it's that energy scarcity, high prices for oil, it was going to force economies to get more local. It sounds almost like if that did happen, it would have a knock-on effect that's similar to what you're advocating.
Yeah. I mean, up until, when oil was $20, $30 a barrel, transport costs were incidental. And you got to remember that no matter how you move goods, by boat, by air, by rail, by truck, you're burning one fuel and one fuel only. I mean, maybe that'll change in the future, but right now it's oil. But all of a sudden, when oil's $150 a barrel, those transport costs are no longer incidental. And if oil got high enough, then the transport costs would start to offset the wage arbitrage that has moved all of that production to low wage labor forces. So you're right. It would have gotten at it in a different way than, for example, tariffs, but it would result in the same thing, a repatriation of long lost manufacturing jobs, because in a world of triple digit oil prices, distance costs money. In a world of $20 to $30 a barrel oil prices, distance doesn't matter because transport costs don't matter.
However, well, I'm guessing that this is an effect of the pandemic that you don't appreciate, which is that oil prices are now extremely low. Airlines are begging people to get on their flights. So it's for reasons you couldn't have predicted. It's the opposite world from the one you predicted in your
That's right.
book. But,
and I guess the question will be, and here's the quandary. When oil is $30 to $40 a barrel, and if we were to take the COVID-19 out of the equation, what will people do? They'll burn more oil. Okay, they won't buy Teslas, they'll buy SUVs. So that's the real dilemma if we're going to decarbonize, is that as demand falls, prices fall, and we get a rebound effect. So if we're going to decarbonize, it's probably not through carbon taxes, it's probably through regulation. Like, for example, Ontario about 10 years ago banned coal-fired generating capacity. They closed the Nanaco coal plant. It would have taken carbon taxes of over $100 a ton to achieve the same result. And people would have balked at that, and rightly so. But all of a sudden, when you just say we're not allowing coal-fired generating plants to be built, people just accept that. So if we are going to decarbonize, I think it's going to require more of the regulatory approach than the carbon tax approach.
There are sectors of the economy that have stubbornly resisted any kind of globalization. And here in Canada, to pick just two, there's the dairy industry, which still operates on the basis of early Cold War era supply management system, and your old sector, the banking system, which is a heavily regulated oligopoly. In a sense, like, isn't it ironic that here in Canada, some of the bankers who themselves, it's one of the few parts of the economy that's so heavily regulated.
Sure, they're all for telling the government to open up and sign free trade agreements, but that of course doesn't apply to the chartered banking system, because that gives them an oligopoly and gives them oligopoly rents. But when they're asked to advise on any other industry, like autos, for example, they're all usually in favor of globalization. So that's a very astute observation, Jonathan.
So going back to Matthew, he's mentioning that when we talk about trade, we think of trade in widgets. But of course, globalization also means trade in ideas. I guess we have to distinguish that. I guess one nice thing that we have seen during the pandemic is there has been an enormous sharing of scientific information and virological information across borders. And of course, even when there's no pandemic, cultural memes go back and forth. You have the United States exporting their movies. What's your take on the billions and billions of dollars of intellectual property that travels across borders every day in the form of culture, scientific information? patents and that sort of thing. Is that part of your thesis?
Well, that's a very interesting issue because it was part of the China-US trade dispute. And that is the billions being ripped off of intellectual property, because one of the conditions of a company operating in China is they had to share their intellectual property with their Chinese partners. And if you want to talk about ripping off, I mean, talk about Huawei and the 5G telecommunication equipment. Why couldn't we buy it from a Canadian firm like Nortel? Because it went under, and no small reason, because its intellectual property is widely alleged to have been ripped off by Huawei. So, I think that is very much going to become more and more part of trade disputes and trade agreements. Because, even people who didn't agree with Trump's tariffs in the United States agreed with him all of a sudden demanding an end to the ripping off of intellectual property by American firms in China.
I know we only have a few minutes left, but there's a couple of questions here. One from Lewis. I'll kind of summarize them. They're talking about international comparisons. If Canada were to look for a model for other countries, the way they responded, of course, no country is an island, and you can't be isolationist, or if everybody else is playing by one set of rules, it's hard for countries to go at it alone. But are there any other countries out there whose policy direction you take inspiration from and you think Canada could learn from?
I mean, what I describe in the Expendables is not particularly about Canada. I mean, there is Canadian content in it, but this is a pan-OECD phenomena. And, we could be talking about Australia. My book's published in Australia, so I've done a number of these kind of events there. And, the stories people tell me are exactly the same stories that you would hear in Oshawa or you would hear in Detroit. Boris Johnson got the biggest majority of a Tory since Margaret Thatcher by sweeping industrial ridings that used to typically vote Labour. And of course, the rise of right-wing populism in places like Germany and France and Italy. It all comes out of the same set of conditions, and they've all seen the same kind of dislocation. So it's not like one country has done better than the other, but I think, the change in the United States has been a game changer because it has empowered similar type thinking in other places, not in Canada, but certainly in the UK and Western Europe.
A lot of big cataclysmic policy changes are driven by catastrophes. Do you think that there's some point we're heading to in terms of our economy? Maybe the pandemic is it, but that is going to be a catalyst for the kind of change you're talking about?
And I think for the Expendables, COVID-19 is a good news story. And I'll tell you why. Because every pandemic, going back to the bubonic plague, to the Spanish flu, has raised wages in their wake. Now, the reason they raised wages in their wake was just the physical decimation of the labor force. There were less peasants to work in the fields. There were less workers to work in the factories. Hence, the price of labor got dearer. Hopefully we're not going to see that kind of physical decimation. But by severing global supply chains, by making people question the benefits of globalization, by all of a sudden favoring economic self-sufficiency, we may have the same process. We may have jobs that we thought were gone forever coming back. And who knows, for the first time in 50 years, the Expendables in North America might actually get a real wage increase.
Well, wage increases, I think, would be nice for a lot of people. Long time coming. Yeah. And I know that at 8 o'clock, we're expecting Principal Keel to come on. I'm not sure if he's ready yet, or if we have time for one or two more questions. Light just went off.
For it. It's okay. I can listen to this all night.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question, because this is one of the questions that came in earlier. And this is how Lewis phrased the question. He was talking about certain countries, and you see this in, like, for instance, Mexico. I know you see it in India. The movie Parasite talked about it in South Korea of all places, a brilliant movie, which is actually a lot about the Expendables, the Korean version of it, where you have like a class of super, super rich people and everybody else. And yet these things seem to happen in all kinds of economies. Like
Right.
it's happening. It's not just, you mentioned OECD. So how much of this spans from OECD to places like, in more developing countries like Africa or South America or something?
China. Okay, let's take China. If you look at a Gini coefficient, that's a measure of income distribution.
Inequality.
Okay. Sure, there's been millions created in the middle class, but China's Gini coefficient is one of the highest in the world. And that's not exactly an attribute for a country that officially claims to be communist. That what you've seen, the income polarization that you see in the OECD, you also see in India and China. Like, sure, China's got 350 billionaires and, is second now to the United States. But at the same time, the gap between rich and poor in China is greater than it's ever been. And you mentioned Parasite. That's an excellent example. The same thing in South Korea has happened, and the same thing throughout the developed world. So really, global parity has really been global parity for the rich. That billionaires in Korea and then China and in Russia and the United States and in Canada and the UK have never had it better.
Thank you.
You can jump in now, Charlie.
I will jump in. Well, first of all, after hearing that, who doesn't want a copy of this book? But unfortunately, we only have two to give away. But of course, you could buy the book. Correct, Jeff?
Even better, even better.
With the limited amount of money you have left as an expendable, why not spend it to find out why you've been entered into that designation?
I couldn't have put it any better, Charlie.
So what we have devised, everyone hold tight because you could be one of the recipients of this book, is I'm going to ask Jeff to pick a letter between A and Z.
J.
J. And I'm going to ask John to pick a number between 1 and 20.
3.
So what we are going to do is we're going to go through our list of attendees, and assuming there is someone whose last name starts with a J, who is the third of those people, that will be the recipient. However, should we run through the J's, thanks for picking J, because it may happen. If we run through the J's, we will then move on to the K's. See if a relative of mine happens to be one of them. No, that won't work.
Be unethical.
They've been barred from eligibility.
Yeah.
So let me see now if we have a recipient. Well, I'm not quite sure. I'm just looking to see if I guess it would be number plus letter crunchers have devised who the first recipient will be. But why don't we just go ahead and do this again? I feel like that person who, tumbles the numbers for Lucky Lottery. So Jeff, what do you want to choose? R.
R.
Okay. Oh, like Rubin. Just got
it.
I'm right on the money tonight. And John, for a number.
I'm sticking with 3. I have a strong feeling with
3.
that.
Well, you can't go wrong with 3. It works in so many instances, doesn't it? So we now have R3. So it looks like I'm being told that the recipient is in the chat, but who would it be? Perhaps you could give it to me in the background chat, helpers, so I don't stand here making small talk. Well, you know what? While I'm getting that answer, here we go. Raffle number 1 winner is I think they went a different route. They decided to go with the first name as a J rather than the second name. So I can live with that. I hope all of you people whose last names are J's can live with the fact that someone named Joanna is going to get it. So the first raffle winner is Joanna Beiersbergen. And the second raffle winner, whose first name begins with an R, so sorry, Jeff, but it won't be part of the Rubin clan, is Ruth Donsky. So those are our lucky recipients. And we ask that you contact alumni.innis@utoronto.ca. And let me explain to you disappointed Joneses and Rubins that the reason we had to do it that way, and maybe I could have checked on this before I started this whole enterprise, is that attendees are sorted by first name, not last name. And so we had to go with first names. So, but good news for Joanna and Ruth, that's for sure. So let me say before I wrap this up by giving you a preview of what's coming up next through Innis events, that I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. I always like hearing what Jeff has to say about the economy, and he didn't disappoint. And I must say that it was almost like a thrilling tennis match, because John was like really tossing some great questions over to Jeff. And of course, Jeff doesn't even take a breath and he's got the answer. But I think that it was as invigorating as it was for me. I hope it was for everyone else, but it was in part because of the masterful way that John extracted the questions from both the chat and from the pre-listed questions, and you wouldn't necessarily know this, but molded them in a way that created a seamless conversation. So thanks to both of you for a really informative and, as I say, invigorating discussion. And I hope everyone has had their perspective on this matter tweaked a bit, if you thought a particular way before by Jeff's insightful comments. So we will be switching gears and shifting our attention to the world of film for our next two events. So on October 15th, we will be featuring the film Red Rover as our next Canadian Film Forum screening, and we will have the filmmaker Shane Belcourt present for that. And the moderator will be Mike McMillan, who's also an Innis alum. And then on October 22nd, just 1 week later, yes, we are putting them out like nobody's business. Our events are like widgets. They're just, they keep coming down that assembly line, but they're all quality product. We have The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open. And that will feature filmmaker Ellie Maya Tailfeathers. And I believe the moderator for that will be Rad Simon Pilot. So I hope you'll come back to us for those two events. Thanks again to Jeff and John, and thanks to all of you for being here as our guests. And until the next one, have a great Thanksgiving weekend. Okay, good night, everybody. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Take care.